Jerome May.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise to support this enabling bill. It enables the payment of additional cost of living support for many millions of the poorest in society. But before I go into the detail of the proposals, I think it would be useful to set this debate into the context, which is, of course, that the best welfare, where it's accessible, is access to a job. We know that there are very obvious financial implications of being in employment, but there are also equally important mental health benefits from being in employment as well. And I apply it to... Yes, I will give way.
Could he explain then why 4.2 million people in work are in poverty and that 6 out of 10 people in a low-paid job will still be in a low-paid job 10 years later?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. I'm not saying, and I will come on to this later on in my speech, that employment of any description is the silver bullet. We have got a phased movement under universal credit because it's a tapering benefit from unemployment through additional support by government as diminishing as pay rates increase. And I think most people in this House would accept that that is the right approach. But I also accept an intervention that the Honourable Lady made earlier, where she rightly drew attention to the disability employment gap. And whilst I recognise, as did the Secretary of State, that there has been a recent upward tick, unwelcome upward tick in that, the direction of travel and the long-term trend is downward, and I wholeheartedly welcome that. Turning to my own constituency of Broadland, the universal credit claimant rate is just 2%. So bearing in mind that a percentage of those will be in employment, it shows that in my part of the country at least, we are benefiting from full functional employment. And in fact, the national average is just 3.6%. I think we should recognise that that is a real feather in the government's cap, particularly, Mr Deputy Speaker, when you look at youth unemployment. So the often hard to employ or 18 to 24-year-old sector, the sector which is most quickly affected by economic downturn, in Broadland, the universal credit rate, claimant rate for that cohort is just 3.6%. and 4.6% nationally. And I think it is worth, Mr Deputy Speaker, taking a moment to make some international comparisons. Because if you look at France, where the 16 to 24-year-old rate of unemployment is over 20%, or look at Spain, where the equivalent figure is about 35%, you can see that something is happening in the United Kingdom that is not happening because of the policies of the European mainland. And my submission to you, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that is the result of conservative policies leading to fuller employment, particularly in those cohorts who traditionally have found it harder to gain and retain employment. And that's down to the brave decisions of this and former Conservative administrations in creating a dynamic labour market that has allowed and encouraged employment and, yes, the ability to reduce your employment count if you're an employer. That has led to fuller employment in this country than areas which are perhaps more unionised, where once you're in the club, your job is protected, but it comes at the cost of the young, it comes at the cost of the poorest. And I think the government has been absolutely right to focus on a dynamic labour market, in addition to direct government support in schemes such as the £2 billion Kickstart, a scheme that works so well in the aftermath of the pandemic, and the Restart scheme, which also was cost an eye-watering £2.9 billion. But what it did is that where you've been a claimant of universal credit for 9 months or more, you got additional focus from your Job Centre Plus work coaches to help you step back into employment so that you counter the terrible drain on the country as well as the individual cost of people's lives of long-term unemployment. And that brings me neatly, Mr Deputy Speaker, to those work coaches, because it was this government that doubled the number of work coaches in 2021, increasing them by 13,500. And I've seen them at work in my own constituency at the Job Centre Plus in Fakenham. And I want to pay particular tribute to all the staff members there who have a huge amount of enthusiasm and expertise when they're going the extra mile, day in, day out, to get my long-term unemployed, of which there are in total UC claimants in Broadland, 1,130. They're not all long-term unemployed. But there's that hardcore group that in a period of full employment, we just need an extra bit of help to get them into the jobs which are available. Then the additional work coaches are exactly the right way to go, and it's paying fruit. And then also, there is the apprenticeship schemes which are being supported and encouraged by the government. Members around the House will recall that 2 weeks ago it was National Apprenticeship Week, and to celebrate that and to encourage its further uptake, I visited a business in my constituency called Ben Burgess, who many in the East will recognise as agricultural machinery suppliers of great repute. That company has, at any one time, about 30 apprenticeships, starting typically at the age of 16, and they get taken through training both on the job and also at a national training facility in the Midlands, where they have university-style education as well as on-the-job training in their place of employment. And they come out of that scheme with a machinery technician qualification and a job and a career, leading to a really fulfilling lifestyle. And I think that is exactly the kind of thing which the government should and is supporting. And then I can't move on from this area of my speech, Mr. Deputy Speaker, without a little plug for my own jobs fair, which is taking place at Taverham High School on the 10th of March. It's one of a series that I've been holding and will continue to hold. When I first set my first one up was in Fakenham, in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, and my assumption was that we would have a tidal wave of unemployment. The estimates at the time was that we were going to have 12% unemployment. So I set in place a jobs fair to try and solve that problem. But because of the intervention, the incredible intervention of the then Chancellor, the now Prime Minister, we didn't have 12% employment. The government put its arms around the economy, supported people in their jobs, and that potential crisis did not materialise. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, turning to the detail of this proposed legislation, I fully support the uplift in the national living wage by 9.7%, taking it to £10.42 an hour. And the reason I do isn't just for those whose employment is at the national living wage, but as a former employer myself, I know very well that the national living wage is the base upon which many, many layers of employment judge their own job offers. Because we've created the conditions where there is full functional employment in the vast majority of the country, employers are having to compete for staff. And one of the ways they compete, it's not the only one, but one of the ways you compete is by pay. And as the national living wage base rises, the gradated competition in pay rises as well. So it has a really beneficial effect. I will happily give way.
From Broadland for giving way. I don't know if you've seen the budget submissions of both the CBI and the TUC. It's not often that both of them sing from the same hymn sheet, but when you look at the budget submissions, one of the key themes that they are complaining about and that they're raising concern about is issues around staffing shortages. So whilst I accept that the national living wage is one factor in this, does he also accept the concerns of both the CBI and the TUC that this government has got a problem when it comes to staffing issues that cannot necessarily be helped with something like Brexit?
I'm really grateful to the Honourable Member for making that intervention, because we've had a similar discussion at an earlier debate. What I kicked myself for not saying last time, he now gives me the opportunity to say, which is that as a former employer, if you have access to, let's call it unlimited, cheap labour, then there is no incentive to increase your productivity. There's no incentive to invest in further plant and machinery. And as a result, we have what the Honourable Member was also complaining about, which is the low productivity conundrum. And when it comes to access to labour, I do recall in an earlier intervention a couple of weeks ago, the Honourable Member said in Scotland, the problem isn't having too many people, it's having an exodus of people from Scotland. Yeah, and I just wonder, what is the difference between Conservative-run England, where people in their hundreds of thousands are seeking to come into this country, and SNP runs Scotland, where they're leaving in their tens of thousands.
I'm for giving way, and I'm hopefully allowing him to sit down and just think about that just a little bit further might help him. But the reality is immigration policy is controlled by the United Kingdom government. The Scottish Government, huge swathes of civic society have said that our problem has never been immigration, our problem is immigration, and what we're looking to do is to get more people to come and live and work in Scotland, and it's the UK government, it's the Home Office that makes that more difficult. Even just on Friday I had an asylum seeker at my surgery, somebody who's incredibly well qualified, who has something he wants to offer this country, but because of a decision taken in 2002 by the Labour government, he is restricted from working here. He wants to work in Scotland, but he cannot do that because of an intransigent UK immigration policy. That's the reality of our immigration problems. It's not some sort of mini tartan issue that you might want to dress it up as.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. It does, Mr Deputy Speaker, stray probably a little bit too far from the topic of this debate. This isn't a debate about immigration policy, but I do note in passing that if you want to encourage people to come and work in your country, having a super tax on employment is probably not the best way to go about doing it. Mr Deputy Speaker, the cost of living, inflation, hits working families too. So I welcome the £900 cost of living payments, which will benefit fully 8 million families in this country, as well as the disability payment of £150 to help with the higher cost of equipment needs. And that will also benefit some 6 million people. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, if a job is the best form of welfare, then reducing inflation is the best way to tackle the cost of living crisis. So my commendation to the Minister is that we should stick to our guns, that reducing inflation during the course of this year, halving it as the Prime Minister has promised to do, is absolutely the right way to do it. And the Bank of England currently predicts that inflation will dip below 4% by the end of this year. And that overwhelmingly is the best way to deal with these longer-term problems, not one-off payments where we're seeking to address a symptom rather than dealing with the cause. And I'm very grateful that the government, whilst it's necessary to address the symptoms in the way that this proposed bill does, is also dealing with the cause of the cost of living, which is inflation caused by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And that is the long-term solution to these problems.